शीतला सस्यश्यामला मातरं वन्दे मातरं शुभ्रज्योत्स्ना पुलकितयामिनी पुल्लकुसुमित द्रुमदलशोभिनी सुहासिनी सुमधुरभाषिणी सुखदां वरदां मातरं वन्दे मातरं वन्दे मातरम्.
Good afternoon to all. The Office of Institutional Advancement welcomes you to the Leadership Lecture Series Fireside Chat with Dr. Shashi Tharoor. I now invite Mr. Kaviraj Nair, CEO, Office of Institutional Advancement, to introduce our guest of honor.
Good evening, everyone. It's an absolute honor for me to introduce the guest of honor for this evening, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, to this event. I know that he does not need an introduction, but still let me do this. Dr. Shashi Tharoor, a third-term member of Parliament for Thiruvananthapuram, is the best-selling author of 23 books, both fiction and non-fiction, besides being a former Under-Secretary General of the United Nations and a former Minister of State for Human Resource Development and for External Affairs in the Government of India. He has won numerous awards, including the Pravasi Bharatiya Samman, a Commonwealth Writers' Prize, and the Crossword Lifetime Achievement Award. In 2019, Dr. Tharoor was also awarded the Sahitya Academy Award in the category of English non-fiction for his book, An Era of Darkness. He is a member of Parliament's Standing Committee on Information Technology. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I will now invite Professor Mahesh, Alumni and Corporate Relations, IIT Madras, who will be moderating today's interaction, and Dr. Tharoor to come on stage.
Good evening, everybody. It's an honor to be sharing the stage with one of the greatest luminaries of our time, one of the greatest public intellectuals of our time, Dr. Shashi Tharoor. One more round of applause, please.
Thanks very much. It's great to be back and good to see you all here.
Full disclosure to start with, this was set up well before he declared his candidacy for the
It's not a campaign event. Yeah.
President of the Congress Party. So I want to start off by talking a little bit about your education, Dr. Tharoor. You received your PhD from the Tufts Fletcher School at the age of 22. We have about a third of our student count at IIT are PhD students. So please tell them how to finish a PhD under the age of 22.
Well, actually, don't try it is my first piece of advice. But secondly, it can't be done anymore, not even at Fletcher, because I used some obscure provisions of the rules of the institution in order to short-circuit certain procedures. And I mean, the reason I did that was both because I was in a hurry to start real life, leaving the ivory tower, but also because I was in mortal fear of running out of scholarship money to be able to continue. So I thought the quicker I finish this, before my scholarship runs out, so much the better. But there was, for example, I mean, I don't want to bore everyone here, but they had a provision in the rules whereby You see, there were 3 degrees at Fletcher that I managed to do in 3 years. One was the MA, then there was an MALD, which was sort of an MPhil, and that involved a dissertation and so on. And then there was the PhD. Now, after the MALD, there is a thesis defense and an oral examination in 3 specific fields. And then, after about a year of study, in most cases, sometimes more, sometimes less, you would then take a more advanced oral examination to qualify for the PhD program, and that was called your PhD orals. And that was in 4 fields. So I asked, using this academic petition route, to be allowed to take my PhD orals when I should have been taking my MALD orals, and the assumption that if I qualified there, then automatically I would get my MALD.
But you considered yourself ready for it. That in itself
I did, and the professors were not so sure. I was a straight A student sort of thing, but they said, listen, normally no one passes these PhD orals without, at least 6 months of extra study, if not a year. And if you flunk these, that means you lose out on the masters as well. You don't give you the MALD either. And I took a deep breath and said, I'll take the risk.
Wow.
And looking back on it, I think it was utterly foolhardy, but it saved me a year. And my thesis was actually on the making of Indian foreign policy. I had taken an academic construct called political development, which was essentially invented by American political scientists in the 50s and 60s to justify their friendship towards some rather unsavory countries. Because the argument was that those countries were in the process of politically developing to some sort of ideal norm. So I took the academic jargon from political development, junked where they were applying it, and applied it instead to foreign policy. And I applied it to being, how do you study the development of processes, policies, and personnel in the making and formulation of foreign policy in a democracy and against the standards set by the Constitution of India. So that was the concept. It was fortunately something that passed muster, and I was allowed to research it. And by incredible fluke, I was beginning my research literally weeks after or months after the fall of the Indira Gandhi government in 1977, which meant that everybody who had ever been involved at a senior level in foreign policy making was both available because they were out of a job and willing to speak because they didn't know they'll ever come back to power.
Sure.
So I actually interviewed Indira Gandhi 2.5 hours in 2 separate sessions. I had conversations with all her foreign ministers, all of whom happened to be fortunately alive. I met her top advisors, people like P.N. Haksar and G. Parthasarathi and all the eminence grises in the PMO's office. It was an incredibly fortunate moment to be doing field research because I was given access to insights and I was spoken to with a level of candor that would not normally have been possible had I tried to conduct the same research when the same people were in power. I wouldn't even have got my foot in through the door. But they were relatively available and idle, and so it went. And then having collected this massive material, and then supplemented it, of course, with all the academic work at the Tufts and Harvard libraries, and I also managed to get married during the summer. I was 21 when I got married. And so my wife was then doing her PhD at Syracuse University. And by, again, another wonderful fluke, they had the best library for Indian studies in the entire country, better than Harvard's, because the librarian was a Sardar called Gurnek Singh, who bought every Indian material he could lay his hand on. So Syracuse had this phenomenal collection, things like public opinion polls from India, that there was only one institution in those days doing them, that were not available at the Harvard Library, were available at Syracuse University Library. So I had an amazing treasure trove of material. I worked 18-hour days. I wrote madly, typing on 2 fingers on a Remington typewriter. And at the end of the day, in a matter of, of course I had to send chapters to my thesis advisors in Boston, sometimes drive down to Boston with them from Syracuse. But the net result was I wrote about a 600-odd page thesis in a matter of 8 months. And there was a certain level of sort of disbelief out there, because anyway, you can imagine why. But they couldn't find anything particularly wrong with either the academic logic or the material and the arguments I was making. So I was able to defend my thesis. on a Friday, get on a plane on Saturday, arrive in Geneva Sunday, and begin work at the UN on Monday.
Wonderful.
So that's how my life
Wonderful.
went. No break.
So,
But I would say to all of you, and as I said to my own sons, don't rush it, enjoy life. There's much more to life than spending 18-hour days writing a PhD thesis. Take your time over it. Savor the pleasures that life offers that are well beyond the world of academics. All the things the professors don't want me to tell you. It's actually true.
I only heard you say, put the mortal fear of scholarship running out.
But that is true. That, of course, is a serious matter.
So that's a great story of how you finished your PhD at a very, very young age. And that's incredible, really, as a scholarly, to put together a scholarly document of that magnitude requires, maturity that you have well demonstrated over the several last decades.
It also, unfortunately, betrayed a sort of tendency to workaholism, which I've never been able to shake off all my life. So I kind of stuck to the 18-hour days all my life, and I'm not quite sure, looking back, that was the best way of spending my time.
So let's talk a little bit about your stint at the UN. In your roles at the UN, you've really changed the way UN is perceived by the outside world in many ways, by devising their communication strategy, by planning their media outreach, among many other things. But the prevalent opinion, at least in the young minds, is UN is a toothless organization. Please help dispel that myth for all of us.
Can't entirely dispel it. Yes, there is one reality that people have to accept, is that the UN as a body is, first of all, a forum of member states. It has no powers other than the powers that member states are willing to delegate to it. So the UN is not a supranational government or something, a world government, as at some point people like to imagine they would want to create. I mean, if you've read people like Wendell Willkie, who wrote One World in 1940, there was this idea that after the Second World War, out of the inevitable shambles, which indeed it was, out of the destruction and despair, you would create a world government. Nothing of the sort. Governments created a body in which they would be prepared to put behind some of their own national interests and sovereignties in order to focus on getting the rest of the countries together in a common cause. But by definition, that meant it only worked well when people could agree on that common cause and when governments were prepared to supply the money, the resources, including human resources, and the political will behind it. So example after example where those were missing, the UN did indeed turn out to be toothless. But the Second Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld, explained it rather brilliantly. He said that the UN was not created to take mankind to paradise, but rather to save humanity from hell. In other words, sometimes the best the UN can do is prevent things from getting worse. And as long as the UN could do that, it was worth having. And that, I think, is illustrated by his invention of the entire concept of peacekeeping. Because you see, don't forget again the history. The United Nations was what the Allies that won World War II called themselves. The media called them the Allies. But the body that they worked under, the Charter and so on, was the United Nations. And so in 1945, the victorious Allies of World War II converted what was essentially a wartime organization into a peacetime organization. And if you read the Charter of the United Nations, Chapter 7, it actually lays out what seems to be totally unrealistic ideas of how the UN, being a bunch of allies, would impose peace around the world. That basically the armies of the 5 permanent members, the top generals would constitute a military staff committee that would decide to actually send troops out to hotspots around the world and quell them. Never happened because obviously the Cold War broke out and the military staff committee could no longer agree on anything except when to have coffee. And that was about it. I mean, there literally was no agreement on anything. And at that point, Hammarskjöld, after the first Secretary General had resigned in frustration, Trygve, Hammarskjöld came in and decided there were things he could do despite the fact there was no provision in the Charter. So he invented peacekeeping in a situation where essentially there was a potential crisis that could have got out of control. It was the Israel-Palestine situation in 1948. he basically sent observers there who are from the smaller countries, not the big five who were envisaged to be keeping the peace around the world, but smaller countries that threatened nobody and therefore did not constitute a threat to America or Russia either.
Sure.
And that's how peacekeeping was born. And countries like Ireland, India, Canada, these and Sweden, these became the principal peacekeeping countries because they were middle powers rather than big powers in those days. India was a middle power. And our troops were never assumed to have any imperial ambitions that would actually affect the interests of either of the superpowers. And that's how we sent troops out, for example, during the Suez Crisis to keep the peace after the Israelis were persuaded to withdraw, and so on and so forth. So the UN can do a lot of things when the key governments agree, and it is, I'm sorry to say, largely toothless when the key governments cannot. So the whole idea that the Security Council will maintain international peace and security, which is its original mandate, that idea rested on an assumption of agreement on the Council that has very rarely been available.
I think, the charter is also, let's just say, a live document and is likely to evolve.
It's impossible to amend.
Is it?
Because the bar for amending the charter is so high. The threshold is 2/3 of the members of the General Assembly, which today is 123 countries. Which today is 123 countries. And then what they vote for to amend the charter has to be ratified by 2/3 of the countries in the world. And since ratification is a parliamentary matter, 2/3 of the parliaments in the world, in effect, including those of all 5 permanent members. Which means if a permanent member doesn't want an amendment to go through, it can simply stall it. And in fact, you can easily have a situation where a parliamentarian in one of the 5 countries that constitute the permanent membership, US, UK, France, Russia, and China, a parliamentarian could say, I'm not going to allow this to be ratified, and even the government would be helpless. So as a result, the charter has only been amended once. And that was to increase the Security Council from 11 to 15. And even there, when the resolution was voted, a number of the permanent members were not in favor. They thought it will dilute their powers. But finally, because of the sheer overwhelming weight of public opinion around the world, they gave in and allowed it to happen. But right now, we're in a situation where 30 years of trying to amend the charter to expand the Security Council again by adding more permanent members like India have gone nowhere for the simple reason that this threshold could never be breached.
So post your UN stint, you, I'm sure, had many options, including go the corporate way.
But I should have said one more thing to belie the toothless charge. Though the UN Charter cannot be amended, a lot of things can be done despite that.
Okay.
And under the broad provisions of the UN, you have seen some remarkable things happening. When I joined the UN in 1978, if I had said to anybody, listen, this is going to be an organization that will one day take over an entire country and run it until it gets its independence, that it's an organization that will actually impose sanctions on the entire export-import trade of a medium-sized country, that it's an organization that will actually one day set up an international criminal court that can try citizens of other countries, including their presidents and prime ministers, for crimes against humanity. If I had mentioned any of those things, those being the 1970s, people would have said to me, young man, what are you smoking? Because the fact is that those are things which no one would have thought in the early days of the UN were even conceivable, let alone implementable, and yet every one of those things was done when I was serving in it. We took over both Namibia and East Timor, ran them, won them their independence. We sanctioned the entire import-export trade of Iraq and controlled literally where they could spend their money and what they could import. And of course, we set up the International Criminal Court in The Hague, where even a former president like Milosevic, former generals of the Yugoslav army and so on, have been tried for crimes committed. And now some Rwandans have been tried as well and convicted. And there are prisons in the Netherlands where these people essentially can be sentenced to life and kept there. So you're looking at a situation where the UN has been able to go well beyond the relatively limited role it played in the first 25 years of its existence. So I just want to say that though the charter hasn't evolved, the practice has evolved. And the UN has therefore proved to be an adaptable organization.
That does give us all a ray of hope. I think as we move, as Dr. Tharoor, as you moved on from the UN, I'm sure you had many options. Nice high-paying corporate job somewhere, getting into
I tried that
bank.
briefly.
But politics, what was the calling in politics that brought you back to India? As you have mentioned many times, Thiruvananthapuram is a very rural constituency, and you were living in New York and Geneva. I'm sure you've maintained your connect with India. I've seen that in your writings, but help us understand this transition.
Well, okay, I was always involved with India very much in the sense that I was one of these crazy people who read an overseas edition of an Indian newspaper every week, and at one point for a few years I even had a daily newspaper sent to me which would actually come 8 days after it was printed, but give me a level of detail of what was going on that obviously I wouldn't have got from any foreign publication. There was no internet in those days, so this was the way to do it. So I stayed involved. I was a frequent point of call for visitors from India, including some of some eminence, so I got insights from them as well. And I wrote, and in writing again, I read. And so all of this kept me involved with India. But when I finished the UN, though I had my beady eyes set on returning home, and I had never done anything to relinquish my passport, I was very much an Indian, I still thought that as a transition I could at least try a corporate job. And indeed I was made chairman of a Dubai-based company that paid me an obscene amount of money, essentially to explore the possibilities of investing in India and particularly Kerala. So I traveled about once a month to India and to Kerala. And I took the opportunity not only to touch base with what was going on in the country, but to keep in touch with some of the prominent people I'd met. As the senior Indian at the UN, for example, there's a practice that when the Prime Minister of India comes to address the General Assembly and so on, the senior Indian spends a quarter of an hour, 20 minutes with him before he goes up to speak and has an informal chat. So I had 3 such informal chats with Mr. Vajpayee and 3 such with Mr. Manmohan Singh, all of which were, of course, enormously interesting. Then the Indian diplomats would normally when the foreign minister came, they would invite the foreign minister to have dinner with me, so I would have a long chat to give them some insights into the UN Secretariat's thinking on certain issues. So I knew the foreign ministers of both the BJP government and the UPA government because of those practices. And I made it a point to keep in touch with everybody by making courtesy calls on them when I came to India. And I must say that it came as an astonishingly pleasant surprise because I have no political background in my family to be invited by the Congress Party to contest the 2009 election. And when offered, I didn't hesitate because I had always known that I was interested in politics in terms of its capacity to affect human lives and change them for the better. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote about politics. But to actually get in, I assumed would be impossible because it's what the French call a chasse gardée. It's a closed hunt. Yeah. You can't actually have somebody from outside come into it very easily. And therefore, I assumed that I would never personally have a chance to step into this world. When I was actually asked by the leadership of the Congress Party, would you contest? I said yes without having a clue what I was saying yes to, because I had actually left India when I was 19 at a time when the voting age was 21, and so I had never even voted in an election, let alone seen one close up. And throughout my NRI years, there was no permission for NRIs to vote, and therefore I had never actually seen an election up close. The result, therefore, was that I came in and ended up in a situation where I found it, and I'm somebody who's walked through minefields in Yugoslavia, been sniped at in Sarajevo. I've had my share of adventures, rescued boat people on the high seas, all sorts of adventures. But fighting my first election beat them all because they were one of the most exhausting, challenging things, 23 hours a day, and completely sort of unfamiliar territory. But having done it, and winning by a very comfortable margin, I have to say that I did find it an absolutely remarkable experience and an opportunity that legitimized my entry into politics. So I wasn't this sort of air-conditioned room bureaucrat coming in from outside who was presuming to represent the good people and the voters of Thiruvananthapuram. I was now somebody who had earned the right to represent them by going to them, talking to them, seeking their votes, and winning their support.
Wonderful. Of the 53,000 plus alumni that we have, and this number is representative of all IITs, we only have 2 in electoral politics. Can you help sway some of these students to electoral politics?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think many of you should think about it. In fact, whenever I've seen students who say to me, we're not interested in politics, I promptly tell them, sorry, but politics is interested in you. And the reason for that, very simply, is that politicians are taking the decisions. Politicians are taking the decisions that affect your lives, that reduce or enlarge the options you have when you come out of your educational studies, that set the rules by which you were able to get into an IIT or leave it, that provide the funding that supports your research or doesn't. It's politicians who are deciding what sort of, how closed we are to the outside world and how many opportunities you may have to relate to the outside world. Every single thing, every crucial opportunity that is available to you in your working life is coming to you or not coming to you because some politician took a decision. So it's crazy to say I'm not interested in politics. You may be not interested in the process of politics, but you'd better be interested in the outcome, because the outcome affects your regular lives and in every conceivable way. So when I tell young people, it's not for everyone because the process is tough. Not everything you do to be an elected politician is intellectually satisfying, and if that matters to you, I had this naive idea that I was there to sort of, in a very Burkean way, to sort of represent the larger interests of the people by applying my own mind, before I discovered that the party would tell you what you could and could not do on some issues, that the voters would come to you not just for major development projects or policy issues, but to ask you for jobs and transfers and loan waivers and all sorts of personal issues which they believe, having voted for you, they're entitled to demand help from you to get. And all those things are part of the daily stuff, the warp and woof of Indian politics. And you've got to be prepared for that too. But even if that intellectual satisfaction is not always available, what is vital for you to realize is how important it is that you are part of a process that makes some of the biggest and most important decisions that guide the future of your country. And for me, that's been a great privilege. Of course, for the last 7 years now almost, I've been in opposition. When I was in government, it was much more easy to have an impact. But there are things you can do as an MP, even from the opposition, by lobbying the people in government, by speaking up in parliament, by raising issues that matter, that you can actually continue to sway thinking. Even if you are speaking, for example, against a government bill, which is then carried because the government side has the overwhelming majority, your views, your words remain on the public record. People can find them on YouTube if they don't want to look up the parliamentary debates, and they can see what you stood for, what you believe. So you can make an individual mark even in the opposition. And I would say it's politics is a profession that literally enables you to affect people's lives day in and day out, and nothing in the world can offer that kind of satisfaction in quite the same way.
Okay, quick show of hands. How many of you would like to go into electoral politics? There you go. Yeah. We'd like to see more in times to come.
No, but that's not too bad a number. That looks like about 25 in a group like this. Maybe more, 30 perhaps, who knows. Great.
So, Indian Express in one of their editorials yesterday, they bylined it saying, Tharoor is a scholar politician who has more eloquence and erudition than political experience. I guess they are referring to the fact that you are not a career politician. And the world over, governments are today run by career politicians. Is there room for a career change politician going forward? Do you think some of these people can start off in a career and then make a career change into politics?
Well, I think more and more that's necessary. And I would certainly argue that the only mistake I may have made was how late I came in, because I was past 50 when I entered politics. But for you all to leave an IIT, do a regular job, put some money in the bank so that you don't need to live off politics. Politics if you do it honestly, is a very, very, very poorly paying profession. There is no money in politics in a legal sense. When I gave up my... When I came into politics in 2009, I gave up a $500,000 a year salary, plus perks and first-class travel, plus $50,000 a speech whenever I made one through an agency in Washington. And I gave all that up, and I came to India and discovered my salary was 16,000 rupees a month.
Wow.
And the stenographer who typed my letters in the Ministry of External Affairs was paid 65. But the logic was that politicians have to be so sort of Gandhian and ascetic that they can live on 16, which obviously means that they assume that most politicians have other sources of income. Now, if you're a high-paying lawyer or whatever, you might. For me, for example, all I could live off was my writing, and that was the only extra income I could get. Whereas, and of course, fortunately, my savings from my years abroad. But otherwise, why do you think some politicians feel they have no choice but to be corrupt? Because they have no other way of living on the kind. Now that 16 has gone up to 50,000, and when that raise occurred, WhatsApp was flooded with messages from angry, outraged middle-class people saying, look at these MPs, they voted themselves a 3 times raise. And I asked the people, you know, who send these messages, how many of them actually live on 50,000 rupees a month, maintain a constituency office and a Delhi office, pay staff in both places, maintain a car in both places, pay petrol, electricity, water, and supply endless cups of tea to visitors. Can you do that on 50,000? Obviously you can't. So there is something built into the structure that makes it not wise for someone who is just come out of university, doesn't have a secure family background or resources or assets. I would say pursue a career, make your reputation and make some money, buy yourself and your family the security you need, and then when you feel ready, go in full-time into politics. Someone like Manohar Parrikar did that, and I think he's an example of an IIT, I think the first famous example of an IIT person who went into electoral politics and rose very high. If you wait too long, like me, you may end up not giving yourself enough time to go too high, and then you'll be told by the Indian Express you don't have political experience. I have
no, but
13 and a
you
half
are
in
a
India,
three-term
that's about
MP.
it. That's true.
That's not no political experience.
I'd like to think not. Not to mention that I did see a lot of world politics for almost 3 decades, but that's another matter.
Sure. Let's switch topics here a little bit and talk a little bit about your writings. You have written extensively, and you're a historian by every definition of that word. You've researched history of countries and written your books, including your fiction. You've talked extensively about the British time in India and how they owe us reparations. And, you can go watch Dr. Tharoor on YouTube and the arguments he makes. My question is simple. Why is this not taught to us in schools?
Well, actually it is. The point is that you have to make the inferences from what you're taught. I mean, the basic history of the British taking over India is taught. But you learn battles, you learn dates, you learn
But the magnitude of the disasters are damped quite a bit in the way
I think it's fair to say that it's partially perhaps because we didn't end up with a revolution. We didn't throw the British out in a hostile way. There was what was called a transfer of power, where the Union Jack came down and the tricolour went up. And there was a certain surprising absence of bitterness that allowed Nehru and Krishna Menon to keep India in the Commonwealth even when we converted ourselves to a republic. And then there is an anecdote, almost certainly apocryphal, but who knows, of Nehru being received by Winston Churchill in London. And Churchill saying to him, I'm amazed that after all that we did to you and put you in jail for 11 years and so on, that there is no bitterness on your part. And Nehru said, I was taught by a great man, Mahatma Gandhi, never to fear and never to hate. And in many ways, that was the attitude. Why instill hatred in new generations of Indian students? The British are gone now, let's focus on the positive. So
isn't it,
the tendency to forgive and forget is very deeply ingrained in our culture. But I will say, by all means forgive, because keeping bitterness is not going to do a society any good. But don't forget, be aware, when I demanded atonement from the British, I didn't actually ask for reparation. That was a topic that the Oxford Union gave. So I said, if at all this reparation should be £1 a year for the next 200 years, because you cannot quantify the damage they did, the money they drained, and the value of the human lives lost.
Sure.
Now, Professor Ursa Patnaik, 2 years after I published my book, did a book saying that the actual value of the resources drained from India by British colonialism was 45 trillion pounds. You can never get reparations of 45 trillion pounds. Their entire economy 1 year is 5 trillion.
At least, I think they should do what Australia did to the Aborigines. Just say sorry.
I've said that. They should say sorry. They should teach unvarnished colonial history in their schools, and they should set up a museum. London is a city full of museums, and every second museum is a chor bazaar. It's full of... So, as a result, we have all of these imperial glories being celebrated, including the theft of some of our most precious relics and artifacts, but there isn't a museum to colonialism and to the crimes exacted in the name of colonialism. That's something they could do as well to atone.
Okay, give us 5. India, you've also written about India's rich history in science and technology. From your research, what are some things that kept that society ticking that you think we should all learn and sort of build back a day when we come back to being 23% of the global GDP?
I don't think we'll ever come back to being 23% of the global GDP. That's an unrealistic expectation. It's like people saying we'll be a superpower. I would say we don't want to be a superpower. We're still super poor. We have to look after our core problems. And for me, rather than some of these grandiose ambitions, I don't care what percentage. I mean, I did care that we had come down from not just 23, by the way. In 1700, we were 27. In 1800, we were 23. 23% of global GDP, where under British rule, we came down to about 3%. So the fact is that that's a fact of life. But others have risen now. And I think that it'll be a very long time before anyone gets to that kind of number again. But I do believe that we should have a sense both of what our past has given us, and that includes our ancient past. I'm not one of those who believes that there's anything wrong in harping back on our ancient past, but I will make a caveat in a minute. So we should certainly be proud of the glories of our ancient past, but I think we need to focus on the future. We really do. I think one of the great strengths of the IITs is precisely that you are preparing the young of today for the opportunities and challenges of tomorrow.
Yeah.
And I was talking to the director here about the work they're doing in artificial intelligence, the courses in data science, including the 14,000 students who are doing data science at IIT online. And I think this is great. I went to Silicon Valley a couple of years ago, just before COVID, and some American made the comment that about 40% of the companies in Silicon Valley dealing with artificial intelligence are either initiated or run or they employ Indians. So we have Indians working in America to improve their work on AI and 5G and other such domains. And here in India, at that point, it was felt we were behind the curve. So I was delighted to hear from the director that we are actually now well in front and that we are producing an entire generation of people who'll be ready to take on this cutting-edge work, and that's terrific. Now, the caveat I was going to say about ancient India was simply this. Let's by all means celebrate ancient India, but let's do it with real facts.
Yeah.
We can't have a situation where our Prime Minister asks us to celebrate the fact that he says that Ganeshji's head on elephants, the elephant's head on Ganeshji's body is proof of the existence of plastic surgery. I'm sorry, it's not, because if you think for 2 minutes, the smallest imaginable elephant head will not fit on the largest imaginable human neck. So that was not the example to give. The fact could have been given that India did invent plastic surgery, because the first records ever of surgery in the world have been found. They go back to the 1st century AD. They go to Shushruta, who has detailed the procedure for performing a surgical rhinoplasty.
Yeah.
And this is, 2,000 years ago. That's to be proud of. Let's talk about that. Let's not take the Ganeshji myth, which is a wonderful story. I worship Ganeshji every day because there is an idea there is to worship. But let's not conflate that and make it into a rational argument for plastic surgery.
Right.
This is the kind of distinction. Let's celebrate the past, but in terms of real achievements, of which there are plenty,
Yes.
and not by conflating it and inventing Pushpak Vimans in the Vedic era and so on. Let's be sensible.
But there's enough achievement to sort of celebrate and let the new generation be educated about. And as we move forward, today's generation is very aspirational. I see that in my classroom. While we want to have one foot in the historical past India, learning from it, the India in which these students are going to step in and do their thing, is a very different India from 2,000 years ago,
Sure.
or even 1,000 years ago. What do
Or
you
even
see
50 years ago.
or even 50 years ago? What do you see as the India into which this group of young men and women are going to step into? And what would be your message to them to prepare themselves in the environs of this university so they can equip themselves to do well going forward?
Well, the fact is that it depends on how you want to do well. So I'll have to give you some very, very broad tips. I mean, which are all cliches. You've heard them before in 1,000 speeches, I'm sure, but they're cliches because they're true. One of the most important virtues for success in life is persistence. You will have setbacks. There's nobody who hasn't had setbacks, failures, disasters, even humiliations. It's not the falling that matters, it's how you pick yourself up and move on. So you've got to find it in yourself, that character, that determination to actually persist in whatever it is you've set yourself. Which brings me to the other major principle in life that I've said to people, especially young people, which is learn who you are. Find out about yourself, your own strengths. There is not one human being on this planet, let alone in this room, who hasn't got some special talent.
Yes.
It may not be the talent to win the 100-meter dash. It may not be the talent to get an A+ at IIT Madras. It may not be the talent to write a best-selling novel, but it may be even a simple talent of empathizing with a fellow human being and knowing how to relate to their problems. It may be an ability to make people laugh. It may be an ability to just be the most popular person when you walk into a room. Whatever it may be, whatever your talent is, know what you're capable of, and then be the best version of you that you can possibly be. In other words, don't let yourself down. If you know you're capable of something, for example, excellence in mechanical engineering, but you decide that you'd much rather spend your time hanging outside the dhaba with a cigarette or going to the movies or whatever, and you have therefore either flunked or done poorly in your mechanical engineering exam, then you have let yourself down. And that, I think, is the worst sin. No one can fault somebody who has, let's say, no natural mathematical ability for flunking a mathematics exam. But if you know you have talents, I think the one God-given responsibility each of us has is to live up to those talents. So be the best you that you can possibly be. In any case, nobody else can be you. So be the best version of yourself, and you will, in my view, succeed whatever is the goal you set yourself.
Wonderful. That's a wonderful message coming from somebody who, by his own admission, works 18-hour days even today. Thank you very much, Dr. Tharoor. That was a wonderful interaction. We'll move to question answers, but before that, one more round of applause for Dr. Tharoor.
Folks, I'm happy to take questions from the audience, but we had planned to stop at 6:30.
Yes, so Dr. Tharoor has a hard stop at 6:40, I'm told. We have, as we put out a questionnaire for students to ask questions. So we're going to start with those. We may have time for a few live, depending on how long these go. Go ahead.
Thank you, sir. I will now hand it over to Arya to start with the Q&A.
Good evening, everyone. We received a lot of questions from the student body. I'll be reading out the most popularly asked questions from the students. So the first one is an interesting question. It is from Pakhil Singh. It goes like, how can technology shape or reform international affairs?
How can what shape international
Technology.
Shape international
What can
affairs.
shape international?
Technology.
Technology, yeah. Well, technology is already shaping international affairs. Think of the internet. It's connected countries together in ways that we'd never had before. Think of, as a result, the ability to launch attacks through cyberspace. It's changing the nature of warfare. Think of the geopolitical changes that have happened because it's now so easy for world leaders to talk to each other daily in secure means. It's almost made the job of many ambassadors irrelevant or superfluous. So all of these things, international affairs is touched by technology day in and day out.
Thank you, sir. So here's another interesting question from KV Rishikesh. And KV Rishikesh wants to ask, would you like to introduce any new English words to IIT Madras lingo?
I have to warn you that Professor Mahesh just showed me an article in your Shastra magazine that points out that using big words is actually not a sign of intelligence. So having been suitably chastened, but actually I agree with that article because as you've seen, my principle is that you use words to communicate. And if you use words that no one understands, then you're not communicating effectively, right? So I hope that was there any word I used in this conversation that somebody didn't understand? Right? Was there? So that's the way to go, folks. Don't worry about big dog new words. The only word that I will keep urging you all to do is to read. That's the one new word I will stress. And I don't mean textbooks, and I don't mean the internet. I mean pick up a good old-fashioned book that has nothing to do with your course of study, and you will be surprised, if you're not already in the habit of doing that, you will be surprised at how much pleasure it can give you, how much diversion, edification, entertainment, and escape a good book offers that may actually take you away from the stresses and strains of preparing for that next exam.
The next question is from Chotelal Shah, and the question says, we see many IITians going abroad for high-paid jobs. What do we as IITians and government should consider to stop this brain drain?
The brain drain.
Yeah, this is a very tough one because, the brain drain was a genuine problem at a time when some of our best people were taking subsidized education from places like the IITs and going abroad and never coming back. I can tell you that when I went abroad in 1975 with a liberal arts degree, but with about a full scholarship from an American institution, the entire graduating batch of IIT Bombay that year got scholarships to American high-tech institutions. The guy came first probably got MIT or Harvard or Caltech or whatever, and the guy came last may have got Rensselaer Polytechnic, but every single person in the batch got scholarships to go abroad, and they went abroad. And people who left India at that time, in the 70s, it was assumed would never come back. They found jobs for which there was no equivalent in India, using technological skills that they had felt they could not apply in India and so on. And I think, forgive me for sounding like a Congress politician, but all that changed really after Rajiv Gandhi brought in this idea of a bridge to the 21st century with the telecoms revolution and the IT revolution. So that by the 90s, we were producing software programmers and so on who could actually do an enormous amount of work that needed to be done in advanced economies. And you had a situation where, fortunately, in the course of the 90s, a lot of cables were laid that made the development of international communications and technological communications possible. And then the final breakthrough came with the Y2k crisis, when there was this complete scare, which I hope was engineered by some IIT graduate, saying that all the computers in the world would crash unless all these companies around the world spend lots of money hiring Indians to fix the code so that it wouldn't crash at midnight in the year 2000. Anyway, the result was that, of course, there was this complete breakthrough and Indians suddenly found themselves able to work abroad and so on, as well as, of course, to gain from being abroad. So what had been a brain drain became a brain gain. And what's more, some of those people who went without any intention of coming back started investing in the new possibilities in India, started investing in companies here, started, I hope, making donations. Mr. Kaviraj is sitting here making donations to their institutions like IIT, so that you actually had possibilities of the brain drain being reversed. Then we went through a period in the first decade of the 21st century where people actually did come back, where there were more people coming back than choosing to stay abroad. Sadly, there was a setback to that in the second decade of the century. And I hope that we can turn it around once more in the third. I really feel that our ability to keep the traffic two ways, to benefit from those Indians who've anchored themselves abroad, but to retain more talent here, can be done by us doing the kinds of things that in those days you could only do abroad.
Just to add a fact, today only between 5 to 8% of our graduates leave the shores of India.
Really, 5 to 8% of your
That's it.
graduates. That's terrific news. Great.
Last question, please.
So we'll be taking the last question. It is from Bhavya Nambutiri, and it is related to college life. So she's asking, what all things did you focus on as a college student, and do you regret missing out on anything?
No, those 18-hour days were not all spent on textbooks, I assure you. I did top the university in the honors degree in history, but I was very active in the Shakespeare Society and the Dramatic Society of St. Stephen's College, acted in plays. I was a leading light of the Debating Society, was its secretary and member for debates in the Union Cabinet. I founded India's first quiz club on any college campus, was St. Stephen's College in 1973. Now, I believe that every campus in India has a quiz club. At that point, we were the first. I was the founder president. I revived the Woodhouse Society, which did mimicry competitions and practical joke contests on the campus. And I ran for and won the election to be president of the student union. So in my final year, I was president of the college union. So I did everything I possibly could, and I kept writing as well, articles for magazines and newspapers. And I was able to, I had a knack for doing well at exams, so I did that too while I was at it. So that was my life. But I will say to you, a college life without extracurriculars is not worth having, guys. Even if you come top of your class, you will regret not having dabbled in all the fun things you could have done, where you feel what you're capable of and show it to others and let others judge you. I mean, there's nothing better than realizing how flat your jokes are falling, or how ineffective your debating arguments are, or the contrary, how good you are at something that you might not have known you were good at until you had the courage to try it. So whatever you think you can do, if you're singing in the shower, try and sing on a stage, but try something. I'll end with a story which is one of my favorite stories to tell at IITs. I've told it at IIT Delhi, but I'll tell it here. It's about this guy who's walking through a rather deserted campus early one morning and walks past a little pond on the campus, and suddenly he hears a voice saying, "Kiss me and I will turn into a princess." So he looks around, there's nobody around, no girl, no person, no living human being. And then he sees there's a frog at the edge of this pond. And the frog says, "Kiss me and I will turn into a princess." So he looks again, he looks around, then he goes to the frog and he picks up the frog with great curiosity and puts it into his pocket, and he keeps on walking. So after a while, the frog starts squeaking louder and louder. Kiss me, what's going on? Why are you doing this?" And the student says, look, he takes the frog out and says, "Look, I'm an IIT student, right? I don't have time for a girlfriend, but a talking frog is cool." A talking frog is cool, that was his answer. But what I'm saying to you is, don't do what he did, kiss the frog. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, sir.
You have a small felicitation. Now invite Dr. Koshi.
I request Professor Koshi, Dean of Administration, Mr. Kaviraj Nair, CEO of Office of Institutional Advancement, Mr. Satyendra Pandey, IAR Secretary, Mr. Ajay Singh Sitole, Student
With your
General
permission, I'll
Secretary.
take a selfie with all of you, okay?
Sure. Where is the memento? Memento is this? We have a small memento for you, sir. Professor Koshi Varghese. This is our small Angavastram to honor you.
I'm very pleased because I actually made a speech at a university convocation recommending that instead of all the heavy gowns, we should have Angavastrams
Yes.
with the college logo on.
Use this for conversation.
When did you do this?
Yeah.
I made that speech 12 years back.
Good. You give.
Oh, very nice. Thank you.
Okay.
I'd like to see this thing. Got it?
Let's thank Dr. Tharoor, a polymath, public intellectual, and a politician a man of change. Wish you all the best, sir, in your upcoming election. And